The sun rose slowly over the human colony of New Hope, casting a warm golden light over the bustling streets. It was just another ordinary day. At least it seemed like it. People went about their daily tasks, working in factories, tending to farms, and checking in with loved ones. The hum of the colony's machinery filled the air, a sound that had become a comforting rhythm for the residents. They had lived in peace for so long, unaware that the galaxy around them was anything but peaceful. The colony's defenses, outdated by galactic standards, had been reliable but untested. The High Command had been certain there was no real danger, at least, not until the unexpected happened. Without warning, the skies above New Hope grew dark. At first, it seemed like an unusual storm, but then the truth became clear. Those weren't clouds. Gigantic ships, far larger than anything humanity had ever seen, began to block out the sun. There was no mistaking it. The colony was under attack. Commander Rachel Roberts stood at the command center, her heart pounding as she stared at the monitors. The enemy ships were massive, shaped like black triangles, and their technology was far more advanced than anything humanity had. Panic swept through the control room, but Roberts' calm voice cut through the chaos. "Focus," she ordered. "Sound the alarm. Initiate the defense protocols." The alarm blared throughout the colony, a loud, piercing sound that echoed through the streets. People stopped in their tracks, looking up at the sky in disbelief. The threat had arrived, but the worst part was yet to come. The first blast hit the colony's outer shields with an earth-shaking force. The protective barriers shimmered under the impact, but they held, for now. A few more blasts followed, each one making the ground tremble beneath their feet. The aliens were testing the defenses, seeing how much force they could apply before the shields broke. Robert's eyes never left the screen. The colony's shields were holding, but for how long? She knew they wouldn't last forever, not against such advanced weaponry. Their only hope was the colony's ground forces, their soldiers, but even they were outmatched. "Get the soldiers into position," Roberts ordered, her voice tight. "Prepare for ground combat. We need every fighter we can get." Out in the streets, the citizens of New Hope scrambled to evacuate. But there was nowhere to run. The alien ships were everywhere, and their presence seemed to block every escape route. Fear spread quickly, but there was no time to waste. It was time to fight. Captain Marcus Lee, a seasoned soldier, was already organizing his troops. He had seen his fair share of battles, but nothing prepared him for this. The sheer size of the enemy ships made his stomach churn. He had fought in skirmishes on the outer planets, but this was different. This was an invasion. "We need to act fast," Captain Lee shouted to his men, his face hard with determination. "Get to your posts. The enemy won't wait for us to be ready." The soldiers moved quickly, taking their positions in the colony's defense structures. It was a desperate attempt to hold back an unstoppable force, but even as they prepared for battle, they knew the odds were slim. The aliens' firepower was overwhelming, and their ships were unlike anything humanity had ever faced. As the alien fleet continued its bombardment, the colony's shields began to crack under the pressure. The flashes of light from each explosion lit up the sky, as if signaling the end of a peaceful era for humanity. Roberts watched in silence, knowing that their survival depended on holding the line, no matter the cost. "We can't lose New Hope," she whispered to herself. Back at the command center, technicians worked frantically, trying to keep the defense systems online. The pressure was mounting, and with every passing second, it became clearer that the colony was losing the fight. The shields were almost gone, and soon, the aliens would launch their ground assault. Humanity's most precious colony was under siege, and they had little time to prepare. Then came the unexpected. The alien ships stopped firing. For a brief moment, there was silence. Everyone at the command center held their breath, unsure of what to make of the sudden pause. "What's happening?" Roberts asked, her voice tense with worry. "I'm not sure, ma'am," the technician replied, her fingers flying over the controls. They'd stopped. But we're still getting strange signals from their ships. The calm lasted only a few moments before the ground trembled once more. But this time, it wasn't an explosion. The sound was something different, closer. The ground shook violently, and the first wave of alien troops appeared on the surface. The aliens had landed. Humanity had always thought of itself as a peaceful species. They had never anticipated an attack of this magnitude. But now, as the enemy forces began their march toward the colony, it was clear they were in a fight for survival. The siege had only just begun, and no one knew how it would end. "Brace yourselves," Roberts said, her voice grim. "This is only the beginning." Outside, the first clash between humans and aliens began. The sky was filled with gunfire, explosions, and the screams of those who would fight for their homes. The war for New Hope had started, and no one was prepared for what would come next. The atmosphere on New Hope had changed. The once thriving colony now felt like a battlefield, with explosions echoing in the distance and the sound of gunfire filling the air. The citizens, now soldiers, fought desperately to defend their homes. The shock of the alien assault had left many disoriented, but Commander Rachel Roberts knew they had no choice but to keep going. The lives of everyone on New Hope depended on it. At the command center, Roberts paced back and forth, trying to think of a plan. Her eyes never left the view screen, where she could see the advancing alien troops, their black armor glinting under the weak light of the twin suns. They'd moved with a purpose, like a force of nature. Their technology was far superior, their tactics even more so. This wasn't just an attack. This was a calculated, deliberate assault. "They're moving too fast," Roberts muttered, watching as the aliens began to breach the outer defense lines. "We can't hold them off for long." Beside her, her second-in-command, Lieutenant Jack Stone, spoke up. "We still have the underground bunkers. They can't reach them if we hold the outer ring. But we'll need to act fast." "Do it," Roberts ordered, her voice steely. "Tell Captain Lee to rally the troops and make sure every civilian is accounted for. We need to get as many people underground as possible." The command was issued, and within moments, the evacuation of the outer colony began. Lee's soldiers, who had already been fighting off alien troops, now moved to assist with the evacuation. Civilians flooded the streets, trying to find shelter. But the enemy was already too close. They were relentless, methodical. No one was safe. At the front lines, Captain Marcus Lee led his troops, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of weakness. The aliens were everywhere. They moved in formations, their weapons deadly and precise. Lee knew that they were outmatched, but he wasn't about to give up. Not yet. "Hold the line," Lee shouted to his men as they took cover behind barricades and blasted back at the advancing forces. "We cannot let them breach the colony walls." But despite their efforts, the aliens kept coming. They were like a tidal wave, overwhelming everything in their path. Lee's soldiers fought fiercely, but it was clear that their weapons weren't enough to stop the alien forces. The aliens' armor was nearly invulnerable, and their weapons tore through human defenses like they were made of paper. As the first alien soldiers breached the inner gates, the human defenders began to fall back. It was the only option they had left. They had to get to the bunkers. Inside the command center, Roberts clenched her fists, her mind racing for a solution. "We need to turn the tide," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Then, a voice crackled through the comms. "Commander, we got something on the scanners. It's coming from the enemy fleet. It's not like anything we've seen before." Roberts raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "It's a signal, a frequency that's unlike any standard communication we've ever intercepted. It's almost like they're calling for reinforcements." "Reinforcements," Roberts repeated, her stomach sinking. "How many more?" The technician didn't have an answer. They couldn't be sure, but the signals were strong. It was clear the aliens had more resources waiting, more ships, more troops. And if they were calling for backup, that could only mean one thing. New Hope was going to fall, unless something drastic happened. "Shut down that signal," Roberts barked. "We can't let them get through to their fleet. Find the source and jam it now." But it was too late. The signal had already been sent, and Roberts could only watch as more ships began to appear in the skies above. The reinforcements were already on their way. The human soldiers, now retreating into the bunkers, prepared for the worst. They had lost the outer perimeter. The aliens had pushed through with ease, and their reinforcements were rapidly closing in. The colonists were out of time. But then, something unexpected happened. A loud crackling sound came through the comms, followed by a deep, ominous voice. "This is Commander Ilara of the Andromeda Coalition. You are not alone." The voice on the other end was not human. It was alien. But it wasn't one of the attackers. Robert's eyes widened as she heard the words, "The Andromeda Coalition." It couldn't be. The Coalition was a group of scattered alien factions that had been rumored to help humanity in its darkest hour, but no one had ever believed they would come to New Hope. They were scattered across the galaxy, outnumbered by the very forces that were now attacking the colony. And yet here they were. "Commander Ilara, you're alive?" Roberts asked, barely believing her ears. "We've been tracking the enemy," Ilara's voice responded, calm and clear. "We're coming to help, but you have to hold on. The galaxy is about to change." Hope surged through Robert's chest like a wildfire. They weren't alone after all. The Andromeda Coalition was on their way, and they weren't the only ones who had been watching the alien siege. Humanity had allies, unexpected but powerful. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. "Prepare for reinforcements." Roberts called out to her troops. "We're not done fighting. This colony belongs to us." The siege was far from over, but with new allies arriving, there was a glimmer of hope. And hope was all humanity needed to keep pushing forward. The tension in the air was thick, but Commander Rachel Roberts felt a spark of hope that she hadn't experienced since the first blast of the alien siege. The voice of Commander Ilara from the Andromeda Coalition was a lifeline that cut through the chaos. There was no time to lose. The reinforcements from the Andromeda Coalition were on their way. But how much time did they have? "Commander, we need to secure the landing zones. The aliens are too close," Lieutenant Jack Stone said, his voice filled with urgency. He and a handful of soldiers were stationed in the southern defense line, trying to hold off the alien forces. Every minute counted. Roberts nodded, her mind racing with possible plans. "Prepare the southern barricades. We can't afford to lose any more ground." As Stone relayed the orders, Roberts turned to the view screen. The alien forces had split into smaller squads, their movements as precise as ever. It was clear that they were well trained, and their weapons were lethal. The first wave of reinforcements from the Andromeda Coalition would be their only hope for survival. The view screen flickered for a moment, and a new transmission came through. The voice of Commander Ilara crackled over the comms. "We've arrived in the system. We'll be landing at the designated zones in T-20 minutes. Hold your ground." "Commander Roberts, we'll break through." Roberts' heart raced. The countdown was on. She had just enough time to prepare her soldiers for what came next. But would 20 minutes be enough? She grabbed a nearby microphone and spoke into it with as much authority as she could muster. "All units, this is Commander Roberts. We're about to receive reinforcements from the Andromeda Coalition. The enemy is closing in, and we need to buy them as much time as possible. Do not let them breach the last line of defense." Her voice rang out across the colony, reaching every soldier, every citizen who had taken up arms. Their battle had been long, and many had already fallen, but they weren't about to give up. Humanity had always been the underdog, but now, with an unexpected ally, they stood a chance. As the last human soldiers positioned themselves at the barricades, Commander Roberts stood tall at the command center, eyes fixed on the view screen. The countdown continued. Just a little longer, she whispered under her breath. Meanwhile, on the front lines, Captain Marcus Lee was doing everything he could to hold the alien forces back. His soldiers were weary, their ammunition running low, but they fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Every shot they fired was a message. Humanity would not fall easily. The alien forces had begun to adapt, adjusting their tactics to counter the humans' defenses. Lee knew that their position was becoming untenable. He had to buy them more time. He had to hold the line, no matter the cost. He signaled to his second-in-command, Sergeant Carafields. "We need to slow them down. Take the southern barricades and reinforce the eastern flank. We can't let them break through." Sergeant Fields nodded, rallying the troops. "Move out now." The soldiers under Fields' command quickly moved into position, aiming their weapons at the incoming alien squads. They had only one objective: survive. They had no choice. Back at the command center, Roberts watched the front lines with bated breath. The alien forces were relentless, and her soldiers were fighting to the very last breath. But the clock was ticking. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, a massive bright flash appeared in the sky. It wasn't a typical explosion. It was a signal. It was a message. The Andromeda Coalition had arrived. The first wave of ships descended from the heavens, their sleek, advanced designs cutting through the atmosphere with ease. The aliens immediately took notice, adjusting their tactics to engage the new threat. But they weren't prepared for what came next. The ships of the Andromeda Coalition opened fire, their weapons far more advanced than anything humanity had ever seen. The aliens recoiled, their armor unable to withstand the onslaught. The tide of the battle was shifting. "Hold your positions," Roberts shouted into the comms. "The reinforcements are here. We're going to push them back." The human soldiers, emboldened by the arrival of the Andromeda forces, rallied and charged forward. The sound of their weapons echoed through the air as they fought side by side with their unexpected allies. The aliens were being overwhelmed by the sheer force of the combined assault. On the ground, Captain Lee's eyes widened in surprise as he saw the alien forces falter. For the first time since the siege began, the humans had the upper hand. He could hardly believe it. "Push them back," he shouted, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We have them on the run." And indeed they did. The alien forces, now caught off guard by the unexpected strength of the Andromeda Coalition's technology, began to retreat. Their carefully laid siege was falling apart. The humans were taking back what was theirs. The sky above New Hope was filled with the flashes of energy blasts, the roar of combat, and the unmistakable sounds of victory. But Commander Roberts knew that this was only the beginning. The war was far from over, and the galaxy would never be the same. As the last of the alien forces retreated, Roberts stood at the command center, watching the victory unfold. She knew that the battle had been won, but the larger war had just begun. The galaxy had underestimated humanity before, but now, with the Andromeda Coalition at their side, the tables had turned, and they would not back down. Not now. Not ever. The tide of battle had begun to shift, but the victory was not as sweet as it seemed. Commander Rachel Roberts stood in the command center, eyes locked on the holomap showing the progress of the fighting. The Andromeda Coalition's ships were a blessing, but the alien forces were not ones to back down easily. The fighting was far from over. "We've pushed them back, Commander," Lieutenant Jack Stone said, his voice laced with exhaustion, but still holding a note of hope. "But they're regrouping. They won't go down without a fight." Roberts knew he was right. The aliens were far more resilient than anyone had imagined. Even now, she could see their forces retreating into the forests surrounding the colony, only to reform and prepare for another wave. The siege was only paused, not ended. "Prepare for the next wave," Roberts ordered. "We need to fortify our position before they strike again." Her words were simple, but the weight of them hung heavily in the air. The humans had bought themselves some time, but they couldn't afford to waste it. They needed more reinforcements, more resources, and most of all, They needed to know the aliens' next move. Meanwhile, on the ground, Captain Marcus Lee was already gearing up for the next fight. His team had just finished repelling the aliens from the eastern barricades, but there was no time for celebration. They could hear the sounds of the aliens' war machines coming closer, more terrifying, more prepared than ever before. "We don't have much time," Sergeant Kara Field said, her voice tight with stress as she checked her weapon. "The next wave is going to hit hard. We need to make sure our defenses are solid." Lee nodded. "We hold this line at all costs. No retreat." But in his heart, he knew that the odds were stacked against them. He had seen the determination in the aliens' eyes. Something had changed in their behavior. They were no longer just invaders. They were desperate. And when an enemy is desperate, they are most dangerous. Back at the command center, Roberts paced back and forth, unable to sit still. The communications lines were buzzing with activity. The Andromeda Coalition had promised to send more troops, but their ships could only carry so many, and the remaining alien forces were quickly adapting to humanity's tactics. The humans had no time to waste. A sudden transmission caught her attention. A new message from Ilara, the Andromeda commander. "We've detected something unusual, Commander Roberts. The aliens seem to be pulling back their main forces. They're up to something. We need to know what we're dealing with." "What do you mean, up to something?" Roberts asked, her voice sharp with concern. "We've been intercepting alien communications." Ilara's voice crackled through the comm. "There's talk of a weapon that could change the entire course of this war. We think they might be building it right under your nose." Roberts felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The aliens weren't just after the colony. They were preparing something bigger, something that could wipe them all out in one fell swoop. "We'll send scouts to investigate," Roberts said, her mind already racing with possibilities. She couldn't let the aliens get the upper hand again. Not after everything they had already sacrificed. As she gave her orders, Lieutenant Stone returned with some worrying news. "Commander, the southern perimeter is showing signs of heavy activity. The aliens are starting to move again. It looks like they're preparing for an all-out assault." Robert's eyes narrowed. If the aliens were gearing up for one final push, it was clear they were ready to risk everything. "Move all available units to the southern line. We're not letting them take that position." Out on the battlefield, the sense of urgency had reached a fever pitch. The human soldiers, battle-worn and weary, knew that this next battle would be their most challenging. Every soldier on the front lines was preparing for the fight of their lives. "We hold this line," Lee said to his troops, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. "No matter what happens, we do not back down. If we can stop them here, we win this war." The soldiers around him nodded, gripping their weapons with determination. They had been pushed to the limit, but now they had a chance, if they could just hold on. The first signs of the alien attack came as a storm of firepower. The ground shook with the impact of massive alien cannons, shaking the soldiers to their core. But they stood firm, firing back with everything they had. Lee could see the fear in his soldiers' eyes, but there was something else there too. The resolve to protect their home, to stop the invaders, was stronger than the fear. And then, just as it seemed like the aliens would overwhelm them, the sky split open with a deafening roar. Reinforcements, the ships of the Andromeda Coalition swooped down, their weapons blazing. But this time, there was something different about their approach, something more aggressive, more decisive. The aliens had underestimated the power of their new human allies. But now, the tables had turned. Roberts watched from the command center, her breath held tight in her chest. She knew that this battle would be the turning point. If they could break the alien forces here, they would have a real chance at victory. But if they failed, she didn't let herself finish the thought. With the combined might of the Andromeda Coalition's technology and humanity's sheer will to survive, the alien forces were pushed back again. The battlefield was a blur of smoke and fire, but one thing was certain: the aliens were retreating. Roberts knew the war was far from over, but today, humanity had taken one more step toward victory, and they would not rest until the last alien invader was driven from their home. The battle had raged on for hours, with no signs of slowing down. Commander Rachel Roberts watched in disbelief as the aliens, despite their relentless onslaught, began to retreat. The sudden shift in their tactics didn't sit well with her. She knew the enemy wasn't giving up that easily. Something was coming, something they hadn't prepared for. On the battlefield, Captain Marcus Lee felt the tension building in the air. His soldiers were exhausted, but they kept fighting, knowing the stakes had never been higher. Yet there was an unsettling quietness now, an eerie calm before the storm. "What's going on, Lee?" Sergeant Kara Fields asked, eyes scanning the sky, the distant hum of alien ships still ringing in the air. Lee shook his head, his heart racing. "I don't know. Something's wrong." Just then, a loud, shrieking roar echoed across the sky. A massive object descended from the heavens, casting a dark shadow over the battlefield. The soldiers looked up, their mouths agape in disbelief. "It's the weapon," Roberts said, voice trembling slightly over the comms as she watched from the command center. "It's finally here." The alien weapon was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a colossal, heavily armed ship, designed to tear through entire planets, to obliterate anything in its path. The sheer size of it was enough to make the heart skip a beat. As it landed, massive cannons unfolded from its hull, pointed directly at the heart of the human defenses. The ground shook violently as the weapon powered up, its energy pulsing in the air like a living thing. The air crackled with static, and the soldiers below instinctively dropped to their knees, the weight of the weapon's power bearing down on them. "We need to stop that thing, or we're finished," Lee yelled, rallying his team. The fear in his voice was palpable, but there was no time for fear now, only action. The Andromeda Coalition's fleet of ships had already begun to reposition themselves, but they were no match for the scale of the alien weapon. They could barely make a dent in its armor. If the weapon fired, it would be the end of them. Meanwhile, Roberts was already in motion, her mind racing for a solution. The communications channels buzzed with updates from various military branches, but everything seemed hopeless. They didn't have the firepower to destroy it. Not yet. "Commander," Lieutenant Jack Stone's voice broke through the panic. "We've detected a weak spot in the weapon's outer shell. It's concentrated near the core. If we can target that." Roberts didn't need him to finish. "Get a team on it. Now. We need that weak spot neutralized, or we'll all be wiped out." Stone quickly issued the orders, and a small group of soldiers, including Lee, began to prepare for the most dangerous mission of their lives. The plan was simple: get close enough to plant explosives on the weapon's weak spot and destroy it from the inside. The only problem: the weapon's defenses were formidable, and the alien forces would do everything they could to prevent them from getting too close. Lee's team was the best of the best. They had been through hell and back. But this was different. The gravity of the situation was something no training could have prepared them for. They needed to move fast, but there was no guarantee they would make it back alive. "Stay sharp," Lee ordered his team, his voice steady, despite the fear that gnawed at him. "We only get one shot at this." As they sprinted toward the alien weapon, explosions rang out in the distance. The Andromeda ships had begun to attack, drawing the attention of the alien defenders away from Lee's team. But it wouldn't last long. They had mere minutes to get close enough to plant the explosives. The ground trembled beneath their feet as they moved, the alien weapon growing ever larger in front of them. With each step, the air grew hotter, the pressure more suffocating. Lee could feel the sweat running down his face, but he didn't dare stop. This was it, their last hope. Reaching the weapon's base, the team took cover behind a crumbled structure. Lee peered out, his eyes narrowing as he saw the weak spot on the weapon's exterior. It was smaller than he had hoped, but it was there, just barely visible beneath layers of alien armor. "All right, let's move," Lee shouted, motioning for his team to advance. They sprinted forward, weapons raised to fend off any alien soldiers that might be in the area. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Explosions lit up the sky as the alien forces made one last attempt to repel them. But Lee's team reached the base of the weapon, positioning themselves near the weak spot. "Ready, Captain," Sergeant Fields shouted, setting the charges into place. Lee nodded grimly. "Do it." With one final press of a button, the explosives were activated. The countdown began. "Get down," Lee screamed, pulling Fields to the ground as the first wave of retaliation came crashing down. A massive shockwave blasted through the air, sending them all sprawling to the dirt. For a moment, everything went black. When the dust finally settled, Lee forced himself to his feet, gasping for air. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked up at the weapon. The weak spot was glowing, faintly, but still visible. "They did it," Lee muttered under his breath. "They've done it." But just as hope began to stir in his chest, the ground shook again, this time far more violently. The weapon was not finished. The alien forces were rallying, and the final assault was about to begin. The battlefield was alive with chaos. The sound of explosions, laser fire, and the scream of ruptured metal filled the air. Humanity had made its last stand, and the stakes had never been higher. Captain Marcus Lee and his team had done everything they could to plant the explosives on the alien weapon, but the war was far from over. The weapon wasn't destroyed yet, and the enemy was regrouping for a final push. As the dust settled from the explosion, Lee surveyed the damage. The alien weapon had been severely weakened, but it wasn't down. The weak spot they had targeted had absorbed the blast, but it was still standing, ominously glowing in the distance. The aliens were smarter than anyone had realized. They had anticipated the human assault. The weapon was now in a defensive posture, and it was ready for a counterattack. "We don't have much time," Lee said through gritted teeth, looking over his shoulder at Sergeant Kara Fields, who had been wounded in the initial blast. She was clutching her side, her face pale but determined. "We need to find a way to finish it," Fields said, her voice strained but resolute. "Now." But Lee wasn't sure how much longer they could last. The alien forces had regrouped, and they were coming in waves. The last of the Andromeda Coalition ships were engaged in a battle for survival in orbit above them, but their numbers were dwindling fast. Humanity had done everything they could. Everything. But there was no guarantee they could hold the line. As Lee took a moment to assess the battlefield, he noticed something. Amid the chaos of the retreating and regrouping aliens, there was a sudden shift. They weren't retreating anymore. They were advancing, and with a level of ferocity that made his blood run cold. "Something's wrong," Lee muttered. He watched as the aliens pushed forward with greater speed, their movements more coordinated than ever. It was almost as if they were preparing for something, or perhaps they were expecting something. "What's happening?" Sergeant Fields asked, her voice tinged with worry as she noticed the same unsettling shift. Before Lee could respond, a message came through on his comm. It was from Commander Rachel Roberts, still stationed at the command center. "Lee, we've detected a new energy surge from the alien weapon," Roberts said urgently. "We think they're about to initiate a final strike. You need to get back to the weapon and finish what you started. This is our last chance. If that weapon fires, it could wipe us all out." Lee's heart pounded in his chest. The odds had always been stacked against them, but now it felt like the final act of a tragedy. The aliens had one last card to play, and if they succeeded, humanity would be obliterated in one fell swoop. "We're heading back to the weapon now," Lee replied, urgency in his voice. "Stay in contact with us. We'll need all the help we can get." With that, Lee and his remaining team moved forward, pushing through the alien forces that had begun to encircle the area. They fought with everything they had, guns blazing, grenades flying, and bodies falling. But it wasn't enough. The sheer number of alien soldiers was overwhelming, and the clock was ticking. As they neared the alien weapon, Lee could feel the heat of its energy surging in the air. It was as if the entire planet was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. "We can't stop them without destroying that weapon," Lee said grimly as he made his way toward the now visible base of the weapon. They were only a few hundred yards away, but every step felt like an eternity. "Here it is," Sergeant Field said, pointing to the massive structure. The energy pulses were getting stronger, and it was clear that the aliens had activated something catastrophic. They were no longer playing defense. They were going for the kill. Lee's mind raced. There had to be another way. Another weak spot. Something. But before he could think, the ground shook beneath them. A massive roar erupted from the weapon as it powered up, and the very air around them began to distort. The weapon was preparing for its final strike. This was the moment when everything would either end or be won. "Get to cover," Lee shouted, but it was too late. The weapon unleashed a blast of energy so powerful it seemed to tear the fabric of reality itself. The force of the energy blast sent Lee and his team sprawling to the ground, their bodies flung like ragdolls. For a moment, everything went dark. When Lee regained consciousness, he was disoriented. His ears rang, and his vision was blurry. Slowly, he pushed himself up and looked around. The battlefield had changed. The air was thick with smoke, and the ground was cracked and scorched. The alien weapon was still standing, though its energy pulse had momentarily stopped, but Lee could feel the ticking clock. The blast had not only been an assault, it had altered the battlefield. The aliens were retreating. No, not retreating. Rallying. "Get up, Lee," Field shouted from behind him, her voice breaking through the fog of his confusion. She was already on her feet, her face set with grim determination. Lee nodded, shaking off the remnants of disorientation. They had to finish this. They had no choice. With renewed resolve, Lee and his team pressed forward toward the alien weapon, knowing it would be a battle to the death. The final stand had begun, and this time, humanity wouldn't just fight back. They would win. The silence was deafening after the blast. For a few moments, Lee thought he had lost everything. He had lost his men, his hope, and perhaps even the last of humanity's chance at survival. But as the haze of smoke cleared, he realized something. The aliens were retreating. Fewer in number now, their organization scattered. They were not as invincible as they had once seemed. Lee struggled to rise, his body aching from the blast, but he could not afford weakness. His eyes locked onto the alien weapon. It was still standing, but there was something different now. The energy pulse that had surged before had dimmed. Something had changed within its core. The aliens had no control over it anymore, and they knew it. They were abandoning their last hope of finishing their mission. "Field Commander Lee, are you there?" The voice crackled through his comm system. It was Commander Rachel Roberts, voice filled with urgency. "I'm here," Lee rasped, his throat dry from the explosion's aftereffects. "Where are the reinforcements?" "We lost most of our fleet in the initial assault," Roberts replied. "We've sent in every available fighter, but it's looking grim. If you can stop that weapon, we can still push back the remaining forces. The galaxy is depending on you, Lee." Lee's mind raced. Every moment felt like an eternity. He was the last hope. He couldn't let humanity fall. There had to be something, some way to destroy the weapon once and for all. The aliens' ability to fight had been shattered, but the weapon, it was still the key. "Field Commander, we don't have much time," Sergeant Kara Field said, her voice steady, though her eyes were filled with fatigue. She stood beside him, the rest of his team gathered around. "The aliens are regrouping. They won't be distracted for long. We need to act." Lee looked around. The battlefield was a mess of destruction, alien debris, wrecked ships, and the bodies of fallen soldiers. But in the chaos, one thing stood clear. The weapon, while still operational, was damaged. The core was exposed, weak from the initial explosion. Humanity had a chance. "We're going in," Lee said, his voice firm. "Everyone, we move now. If we fail, this will be the end." The team moved swiftly toward the alien weapon, using whatever cover they could find. The aliens, while regrouping, were still dangerous. Lee and his team fought off the remaining invaders, taking down stragglers as they advanced toward the core of the weapon. Each step felt like a race against time. The core itself loomed before them, an energy pulse that radiated outward, glowing with an unnatural light. It was a weapon of unimaginable power, capable of wiping out entire fleets, planets, even stars. But it was vulnerable now, its protective shields compromised, and its energy signature unstable. "Lee," Fields called, her voice tense as she crouched by the edge of the weapon's base. "This is it. We're close, but we need to be careful. Any wrong move, and it'll go off like a supernova." Lee approached cautiously, his hand gripping the detonator they had stolen from the alien forces. The tension was suffocating. He could feel the weight of humanity's survival in his chest. There was no going back now. He set the detonator in place and activated the countdown. A low hum echoed through the air as the core began to power down. The pulse faded, and the alien weapon seemed to grow still, its once menacing power now waning. But then, just as Lee thought they had won, a piercing sound cut through the air. The weapon's lights flared back to life. The energy surge that had dimmed suddenly surged back, 10 times more powerful than before. Lee's heart sank. "No, no, no, no," Lee shouted, but it was too late. The weapon was stabilizing again. The countdown had failed. The aliens were regrouping, preparing for one last push. "Field Commander, it's now or never." Roberts' voice came through the comm again. "Do you have a plan?" Lee stared at the weapon in disbelief, then his eyes hardened with determination. He had to act quickly. "Fields, get to the core. We're going to override the system manually." Fields nodded without hesitation. She sprinted forward, taking advantage of the alien forces being distracted by the chaos around them. Lee followed, covering her as best as he could. As they reached the heart of the weapon, the ground shook again. The weapon was trying to charge its energy reserves, but they could still stop it. Lee and Fields worked together, hacking into the system and scrambling the code. They had to manually disable the weapon's core to prevent it from firing again. For a moment, the tension was unbearable. The energy surges of the weapon surrounded them like a storm, and every second seemed like a lifetime. But just as the countdown reached its final moments, Lee's fingers hit the final key. The weapon powered down. The battlefield fell silent. Lee looked up at the weapon as it powered down completely. The deadly hum of energy ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift. The immediate danger was over. But it wasn't the end of the war. The alien forces had been beaten back, but they weren't defeated. This was only a temporary victory. But for now, humanity had won. For now, the galaxy was safe. And as Lee surveyed the wreckage around him, he knew that humanity had proven something. They had been abandoned, betrayed, and pushed to the edge of annihilation. Yet, in the face of impossible odds, they had fought back. The battle was far from over. But humanity had shown that when they were pushed to their limits, there was nothing they couldn't overcome.